So this talk is called Nourishment on the Edge. Can't hear, I covered my ears with my thing. So the practice we just did then, the lying down practice, where we were beginning to kindle that inner warmth. Did people, were you able to feel some of that refuge of your own warmth? Yeah. It's sort of astonishing in a sense that we don't have to pay for that. You know, you can't commodify that. Don't have to go and earn $10 and hand it over. I think that's a very powerful thing. And you know, just I suppose I'm here. I'm kind of backing the power of metta, this loving kindness, metta, as I've mentioned, connected to the word mitta. Sister word of metta is mitta, meaning friend. And then the Sanskrit word that you'll hear more in the Tibetan tradition is maitri, which is this quality of friendliness to experience. And that has naturally some transformative movement to it. It has a power to it. It's not just a kind of weak, fluffy, it has metal. Pema Chodron said something that I think I read this probably 15 years ago, and it's always stayed with me. Probably said it again and again in different Dharma talks, but that without metta or some sort of friendliness in our practice, she gives a pretty strong image that it's like putting ourselves in a blender. It's like putting ourselves in a blender, in the sense that all that the rigor that it takes to genuinely and honestly track our humanness in the inner life, and what we need to see in terms of our own distortions or our own limitations, or also just to meet the inevitable pain that every human being will come across in this life, you know, to stay up close with the hard truths and to not sanitize into a pretty picture, but to see. I think we all know it takes some metal and it takes some metta to also see, and I spoke of some of this context earlier, everything that's happening outside of us, around us, in our environment, in our natural environment right now, in the world, to stay in relationship to the suffering, the flaring inequities that we've been seeing around us. To stay with this also takes some steadiness. So it takes some warmth. I think it takes some warmth to stand up. You know, it's like in the way a child needs to be, you know, cared for to find its developmental movement from lying and then, you know, coming up and lifting up on its arms, you know, and then crawling and then actually standing up. It takes some care. I think also for us to stand up for what we want to back, or just to stand up to speak what we really think, to articulate ourselves, to bring ourselves, all of ourselves, out of some kind of obscuration into some, you know, articulation, takes some warmth to foster that empowerment. And so there's some asking of us, and we can sometimes look at, and there's been a lot of comments around the leadership lately, in leadership in Victoria and Australia and everywhere, and I mentioned that it's interesting that the places where the virus, the pandemic that we are up against now, it's interesting that it seems that it has been mostly well handled when women have been leading. I know one of the women in leadership in Kerala, an Indian friend just told me the other day, just got some big award for the way she's been able to sort of contain that area. think we all can sort of look across at New Zealand and think, wow, you know, that was handled really, really well. She handled that really well. So it's interesting. And so we said the three responses I've been mentioning today, it's a bit of a theme, and they're sort of like the bedrocks of some of the Dharma teachings, of when phenomena arises inside of us, when, you know, the stimuli meets the eyes and the nose or the mind, the touch, the smell, and it evokes responses in us. We have these three more habitual responses that we want to, you know, through that sort of insecurity, we want to grasp something, we want to bring something towards us, we want to substantiate ourselves, we want to prop ourselves up in a sense, we want to pull something in. You know, we want. You know? This is all very human. Or something comes and it's just too much, we have to push it away, we have to move it away. Or the third one, you know, something's called ignorance, the word moha, like we kind of cloak ourselves in we smoke another joint, you know, sort of cloak ourselves. Not that that's always, that might be a useful thing sometimes, but, you know, we could sort of cloak ourselves in a little bit of a fog, you know, to sort of handle the heat of the situation. But we all have very different means of doing that. You know, and I mentioned those words, you know, the way we can sort of block connection, direct connection to something, and we cannot really meet something. We can sometimes miss the mark of that sort of connection. And it's interesting that the word sin, I read recently, one of the meanings of that is when we miss the mark, where the connection doesn't happen. And I spoke those words, you know, from my book of the young man saying to the woman, you know, I understand when someone does something to you, but they don't feel you, you know, it can feel terrible. You know, you want to stay in bed. That sense of when we miss each other, we miss the clear scene. And so one of the ways it said to help, it's another way to think about how we be with our experience, how we can stay open to it. Sometimes said, how do we be if the leadership isn't happening well, if we're finding leadership sometimes not so as effective or as gracious as it could be, how do we be the mother or the father of our own experience? How do we find that standing up in ourselves to bring that clarity and that care to start to look into what's happening internally? And I think, as it sort of, I think, mentioning with Hal a little bit in what he was speaking about, when the power of being able to quieten down, and it's something I think with all the stimuli coming in, I think it's quite a job sometimes. The power to be able to quieten down under the noise, under all the mental fabrications, to start to see clearer. This quietening down, to start to see beneath potential turbulence, or to start to see beneath the movements of our own mind. And one of the descriptions actually of Vipassana that I remember, I always remember teachings, you know, orally, this is probably 15 years ago from a female teacher, one of the first female teachers I saw, described Vipassana as being able to see behind the reactive mind. And that to find that quietude that can sometimes happen when we just feel safe, you know, to find that openness, I think can take some discipline. It's interesting how, you know, we sort of return to naturalness sometimes through discipline. I don't know, I find that fascinating. So the discipline in the service of naturalness, you know, in the service of spontaneity, you need some discipline, like a jazz player. You know, you learn the classical notes, you learn how to play, and then you can actually kind of be much freer to dance. So in the quietening down and into this space that the right view in the Dharma, the beginning of the Eightfold Path, the right view sort of speaks to, it's like a pointing instruction that says that there is something deeper in us than our conditioning, than our assumptions, than our sort of system. There's a deeper way of looking than just these partial views that may be built from views of the past, cultural assumptions or prejudices, or certain views that sort of been handed down. That in the system of ourself, there's something deeper, a deeper way of seeing. And Carl Jung, and I brought him in a little bit. Some of you were there for the 2 streams teaching I gave, where I was looking at these different processes of sort of waking up, a sort of spiritual inheritance, we could say, and then psychologically our development, how we need to grow, and there being these 2 streams that inform each other. I think some of you were there for that. But Carl Jung, it made me laugh. I was reading the other day, he was speaking about his mother. And he was speaking, I just saw a message, I'm not sure, I can't read that just yet, I'll read it after. He was speaking about his mother and speaking how she had these 2 sort of characters. You know, there was the woman that said the right thing, that said what sort of society expected her to say, that sort of punished him when he did the wrong thing and then gave him something when he did the right thing. But then there was this other voice that would emerge out of her that was a lot more, he said, like nature, like ruthless, that would just speak it as it is. And it always came with like an utter authority. And it used to sort of spin him out like, whoa, is that my mum? You know, my mum's got these 2 kind of natures. And he wrote about this. He wrote about this some instinct that would start to move out of her, where she would speak very clearly. And he says this instinct is based on instinct, or on a participation mystique, he calls it, with others. He says it is as if the eyes of the background, so seeing from behind, do the seeing in an impersonal act of perception. So this clarity is not manipulated or fabricated. He goes on and he said, this comes from the natural mind. It's the mind which says absolutely straight and ruthless things, cuts through. He says, this is the sort of mind which springs from natural sources and not from opinions taken from books, not from acquiring more, not from a striving mind, but from something natural which wells up from the earth like a natural spring and brings with it the peculiar, I like that word, the peculiar wisdom of nature. You sort of see it where you clock something that someone says, you go, yes, that is, you're seeing very clearly right now. And it's always sort of exciting, you know, when it cuts through the sort of dross of sort of, I don't know, politeness or this or that. And it's just it's insight. So that this is possible to see like this. So this seeing, this capacity that the Buddha sort of spoke about in every human being, this unfabricated place of natural dignity, natural openness, that definitely needs certain conditions to bring this forward. You know, a certain amount of love and nourishment and, you know, food and clothing or housing. But that given that every human being has access to this direct sort of perception is possible. And that through our practice, we can sort of peel things away to start to align with that seeing. And I think it's like, I think we all know to face life, to see, you know, it is challenging, There's that term about magical thinking. And if I just close my eyes, it will go away. If I just close my eyes, I won't get sick. If I close my eyes, this person won't leave me. That didn't really happen. Just, it didn't happen. If I just turn away. I remember watching like an animal die and, and the animal being dead, but going, oh no, it's moving, looking and go, no, I think I saw a movement in the eye, or I think I saw a movement in the leg. I think it is moving. And then, no, body's not moving. Like to sort of, as a human being, to witness that. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen that in animals or in loved ones. It's a powerful thing to face, to stay with. So I think it takes this nourishment to equip ourselves to stay open to the truths of life. And I had a look at the way some of the leaders first responded to COVID-19, and the kind of natural, this again very human, to go into sort of magical thinking. And I wrote a few phrases down. The Prime Minister of Brazil first said, look, it's just fantasy. And this is said publicly, it's just fantasy. And then said that the Italians said, don't worry about it, this is very early on, go to the piazza. Then in Iran, it said, go to the Qom, go to the holy city, just go anyway. We said, it's okay, the football can go on, just go. Trump said, it's a hoax of the Democrats. It'll vanish like a miracle. And, we see this, and you can sort of feel like that sort of affection, that hopeful thinking, and that sort of optimism. But then we can also see that optimism cost thousands of lives. So that capacity to stay and to respond, because in order to respond skillfully, we have to see what's happening in order to respond. And sometimes at the practice, we're sort of clearing away the debris to see what's really needing attention, or what may be really needing care. And I think it's interesting, because sometimes when we speak about nourishment or we speak about metta, as I said, sometimes in this culture, we can think of these things as being a bit wet or a bit weak. And I'm always trying to kind of like work around that suspicion that I feel we can have, a suspicion of love, or to practice with warmth. And I find that sort of ironic, in the sense that I think then we can more be easily attuned to that which is actually painful. We can say, welcome self-doubt, welcome self-harassment, welcome midnight wonderings. Did my life mean anything? What did I do? We sort of welcome those tracks of mind. We can sort of slip into them very easily. One Tibetan monk said, how easy I let those bandits, through lack of mindfulness, steal the treasure from my own mind. So how easy I let those bandits steal the treasure from my own mind. How hard it is for me to let in our warmth. As Tim Winton says, it seems like for some young Australian boys, Tim Winton says, it's like the tenderness gets shamed out of you. But then we can have a culture that will support addiction or gambling, or as a culture loves drinking to loosen up. It's interesting what's given easy permission and what's harder to accept. I think it's worth looking into. It's those sort of familiar tracks that our mindfulness asks us to shine the light of attention on. Those patterns of worry, those patterns of ill will or inner harassment, those patterns of doubt, the other ones, the patterns of sloth and torpor, sort of fading out. it's interesting when we start to really, the mindfulness, we can track that. We can see where our mind's going, and we're not so swept away. We're not, you know, the image the Buddha once used, it's like when we're swept away by our mind, it's like a guy dragging us by the hands and almost throwing us into a fire pit, you know, like it's that we sort of go down that road very quickly. He uses some very images with a lot of metal. Powerful. He says when we start to come out of some of those mind movies, fabrications of mind that really affect our body, you know, thoughts which have huge impacts on our system, we start to see into this whole operation. Some of the images of freedom he uses to describe this is very powerful. He says it's like coming out of worry, something like, I can't remember this exactly, but something like is like coming out of debt, you know, or coming out of a lot of self-attack is like being freed from prison. There's another one, very powerful image, like coming out of slavery is like coming out of, I can't remember what one, but he shows pretty powerful images is when we come out of certain shackles of our own mind, start to see. And so as I mentioned at the beginning about the context that we're in, these powerful times, you know, the fires at the beginning of the year here, COVID-19, then, you know, the whole movement, the Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter, already seeing in our faces the police brutality, you know, seeing a man with his hands in his pockets just have his foot on another man's neck, and other people watching and not being able to stop that. You know, it's been a lot that is coming to light. And I mentioned, some of you were here for the meta talk I gave at Melbourne Insight, and I said I was going to do part 2. We did part 1. We got halfway through, and then there was more. Some of that more is here, that a Fijian woman, I heard about her through the writer Rebecca Solnit. She works for the environment in Fiji and looking at the rising waters. And this woman said that, you know, sometimes when we're faced with traumas, we have, and that sort of Buddha tracks this, that fight and flight response, which is a little bit the same, the fight, grasping, or the flight, the aversion, the running away, or the just freezing, which is almost like the kind of fading out. It's interesting, it's sort of similar. So we can respond like that. But there's another way we can respond. We can respond, what she calls, through tending and befriending, that we can actually be mobilized into sort of deeper care, that through the shock of the trauma, something erupts in the human spirit that wants to heal the fracture, that wants to kind of cry out for more connection. And I know here in Australia, when the fires were going on, the amount of community action that mobilized around that, I've spoke about this before, but, you know, all the people knitting for the animals that had been harmed. And I heard a lot just through people up north. And I know, Pete, you're here now. I know you had a lot to do on the fires, but the communities coming together, like men and women in the communities coming to each other's houses and bringing food, and, you know, people going off and fighting the fires and then coming back and being restored, and, you know, days and days of this in this country earlier on in the year. See that mobilizing into, you know, into community. I know recently here when there was the lockdown began, and there was a whole lot of people in the commission flats high up that couldn't get food, and there was something about not being able to get food for a child, and then a lot of mobilization around that. The cook who cooks usually at my retreats, Nikki Blanche, just set up a whole movement where everybody was sending messages and videos to those people, sending warm blessings. You know, a lot of these people, migrant people, a lot of African community, just saying, you know, we're here, we get, this is really hard, you're going to come through, we're all thinking about you. You know, this sort of like movement in response. And yeah, there's something sort of, yeah, erupting, we could say, in the fault lines. This is a sort of by the by, but not by the by, but going back now too, but after September 11 in America, and of course that was a whole nother complex incident of why that had happened and power imbalances. But the shock of that, after that, everyone apparently around America, every color, every person wanted to give blood, and they had enough blood to fill so many Olympic pools. There was like too much blood given that the people didn't need. And recently in India, when COVID-19 hit, there was a group of men that went into a factory and said, we're not going to leave so we don't get sick, so we can make enough masks to protect people for 30 days. So you see these astonishing acts of generosity and kindness. We saw recently here in Melbourne with the Indigenous Lives Matter rally against Indigenous people dying whilst incarcerated, and a lack of inquiry into what happened there and what was going on there and what allowed that. There was tens and thousands of people still in lockdown wearing masks that hit the streets, that said, yeah, the lives threatened by COVID-19 matter, but these lives matter as much. These lives need the same attention. And the whole city was absolutely packed, everyone in their masks, as some of you were there, standing up, standing up, very clear. This sort of standing up that can happen. And then seeing all of those protests around the world, and I was getting reports from my friends in New York who were saying, well, it's getting full on the streets now. And part of also that unrest on the street in America, as one of my friends was saying, that in America, the COVID-19, it's the ratio, it's of white to black. One white person gets it to 3 black people because of the systems in the culture of exposure and not enough protection. And that was on the street too, that people were losing lives, their grandmothers, or their uncles or something, that was part of the deep energy that was happening on the street, that there had been a lot of loss, as well as what had happened to George Floyd. Now, I get the news from upstairs from my neighbour who works in the nurses union, and the information just around here, and the people who are getting COVID-19 and then that being spreading, casual workers who can't afford to not go to work, and then keep going, and then it gets spread. So it highlights so much of the systematic sort of failures in our culture, as we're all seeing. And what we said, this burn of coming of to speak more justice and people to find their voice. And I was watching just recently the woman we had in here in Australia, the woman speaking up in Parliament. Her name, Malandiri McCarthy, a senator, and reading out all of the lists of the Indigenous people who died incarcerated. And then in America, another woman, can't find her name. Another woman, anyway, but just in Parliament, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez standing up when another guy had absolutely abused her and just called her the most horrendous names as she was walking into Parliament, and she stood up and just said this huge kind of like speech around, this is not okay, we have to stand up, there's not going to be any more of this. And the whole Me Too movement arising out of the trauma that suddenly we can't get used to what is just not okay anymore. We can't just collude in this anymore. So there's been a lot of movement. It's very powerful. So this tending and befriending and responding to what is actually happening internally and externally, this powerful process. And just coming back for a moment to this empowerment, really, and it is an empowerment, I think, the Buddhist teachings that speak to what is at the heart of us, that right view to be able to see behind the reactive mind that who we are has more space than all that moves through us, that we can afford to ungrip, that we can afford to handle the heat of what moves through us, to withstand it, because it's not our defining quality. So that understanding of impermanent nature, which allows us to ungrip, which allows us to feel deeply, which allows the movement of the inner life, right view. Because when if we thought that my experience right now is the full stop, which some human beings get stuck, when you're in a deep depression, that this is my final moment, this mind state, that's incredibly claustrophobic. If you thought your worst moments, that's where you were always going to be, which is where we can get when we're in a really deep state. That looks pretty dismal. There's no open window in that view. The Buddha's kind of opening the window. It's like, hey, there's more to you. And that kind of call, and then that standing up, and then to feel at the core that openness, that natural dignity, to then stand up and to be able to say, no, that's not okay. I think it's interesting. My brother-in-law, he has been part of the sort of Australia leading this, looking into the use of psychedelics and other drugs to help mental illness. And one of the things some of that those drugs are doing is blasting open the fixed view, that thinks that I'm going to be in this claustrophobic state forever, to shoot something through, to crack it open. So whoa, there's actually more space to widen the view, to almost offer that right view. They've had some amazing results. It's not something that I necessarily say, hey, go out and start doing your microdosing of mushies to sort of get you through. But I think it's interesting. I think it's really interesting what's that's pointing to in us, what's possible, to widen the view of possibility about ourselves. It speaks to something beautiful. It speaks to something transcendent. It speaks to sort of the background, that we are not just a sort of bundle of our conditioning. That's not just who we are. There's something else in the human experience the Buddha speaks to for one and all. But then just now I want to speak to a little bit too, that when we do have a lot of stimuli coming in, and a lot is going on and the heat is on high, it can get easy to be overwhelmed. It's really natural to get funky sometimes, and it's natural with what is happening to be a sensitive being, to sort of, you take up your little portion of sort of feeling that, and there's a collective going on, I think, at the moment. I'm not sure if any of you have felt that. Have you felt that, like a sort of collective anxiety that's in the air, a charge? Yeah, at times, yeah. And so sometimes when our nervous system, and some of you know, I know Ishta knows this well in your work, you're in my view now, working with bodies so much, but when the nervous system is overwhelmed, it's pretty hard to have a connection to this right view, to this wider view. When we are in a state of overwhelm, you can't really say just trust, just relax. It doesn't sort of cut it, like the nature of it being in a sort of unmoored state, or when we're really aflame, is that we can't see that. But if we have that view as a sort of understanding, and really speaking from Dharma practice now, like the training and the study, to have an understanding that I'm not just this, can help us see it through. Yeah, that you just sort of got to weather acute sensitivity for a while. And it's quite uncomfortable in the body. And that when we start to sort of feel more, we're not going to feel supported when we're in that state. It's just, that's the nature of it. It is more of an unmoored state. And it's when we'll be able to settle again, that we can start to sort of feel our creativity or freshness or responsiveness. We're not that great in that state in terms of our action, because the stress can keep perpetuating more stress. It's when we feel that alarm in our system, it's worth really noticing, like I'm really triggered now. And the thinking's going to be off. We're going to be even more distorted, maybe paranoid, whatever. It can have a whole lot of different responses, just to know. And it takes in that time some real settling and gentleness and allowance, and maybe conversation. You reach out to someone. Maybe it's just quietude. We sort of each know, how do we come back to foundations in those moments? So those importance of those foundations and those importance of that nourishment, to be able to come back to a place where we can act from, and to be sensitive to that, and to not add more judgment on ourselves when maybe we are in those more unmoored states. Yeah, because the judgment also just tightens it up even more. And I think part of that wound up nervous system is sort of, again, something that modern culture, it's something we've all got a little bit too used to, what it is to just live wound up. I really think that. And the Buddha would be like, his whisper, like, no, you can live a life deeper than agitation and stress as a human being. You actually can. But it takes some work, because the machine is not going, and that sounds intense, doesn't it? It's like that's not necessarily going to support that unwinding. It's like on a retreat on day 3, everybody goes through the shit first 2 days. The body's sore, the body's aching, the mind's all over the place. You think you're the worst than you've ever been, and you stay with it. You stay in that containment, and then something starts to open. And you see faces look beautiful again. You see something natural, like I said, metta, warmth, restores something natural. You're flowing easy again. We know when we're like claustrophobic. And where do you feel more yourself? Where do you go, do you go, I'm home now in claustrophobia? Or do you go, I'm home now when I feel more at ease? This is more representative of some truth about me. I think as we start to move more towards metta, more towards a wholesome sense of self, or start to more empower our voice, we start to sort of find more of our ground, there will always be, and we see this in the Buddha's career, obstacles. That as the light of our mindfulness grows, as we can register more of our experience, we do start to see where we're knotted up, and we start to become up close with some of the voices that Mara speaks. Mara kind of meaning personifying, our own shadowy voice, the self-doubting, the sniggering, the undermining. That you can't really open like that, or you can't really trust love like that. You can't really do that. You can't actually be at ease and also be in activism and act. You got to stay wound up. I'm just curious about this. How can our action also come from connection? And Mara was something that the Buddha had to work with his whole career, and it's so tricky because Mara lives inside our own thinking. Sometimes Mara feels like our own voice, that harsh voice. It's hard to see because it's like it's stuck up against our own cheek. It takes a lot of mindfulness to really see. And I said it takes a while for the ego to know that it doesn't have to stay in control and judge, to sort of bring everything into order. So that's not okay, that's okay. that we can start to look at what's inside of us more openly. And just start to see when the inner environment feels darkened or it feels more claustrophobic, when the inner environment starts to narrow down. Usually Mara is somewhere around. Mara is sometimes said to be like the full stop, said to be like the limit, the horizon. It's an edge that wants to constrict life, that wants to fix a view. It's fixation, Mara, in a sense. This is how it is, you know. Something else can't happen. Just start to see it when it's there. You know, I see you, Mara. I see that. And we slowly start to not identify with that voice. So we start to have space to see and to look. Just the looking is very powerful. Kind of like brings it out of its sneaky operation to keep us sort of to weaken. And just that warmth needed to also see where our own limitations are and what needs metta, you know, to be able to respond not with judgment, but this is where I need to kind of grow. It's really, really interesting when we talk about metta and how they're asked to welcome and to meet all that moves inside of us, our own awkwardness, our own stinginess, our own controllingness, our own envy, or our own comparing mind, or our own, you know, vulnerability, or our own pain. It asks us to look at where we put limits on extending care to ourselves. Non-caring, this open, unconditional looking. It's like you don't beat the ego with the ego, you know. You got to like let it unfold to feel safer, to widen, because then metta wants to extend out further and further, in further and further, and out further and further. You know, it's said that, and it's really interesting to look at what some of these modern statistics, it's said that we give empathy to better looking people. You know, they've done kind of all these reports, you know, that our empathy will go towards appearances. I mean, it's weird, you know. And when we sort of are asked to look at, you know, the ways where our own limits of giving that genuine gaze to another where they may be, you know. Someone said that racism, you know, it's not just some really extreme hatred, but it can be a broad sympathy towards some people and not to others, you know, where we just turn away, where we don't give the full look, the gaze, to just feel the subjectivity, the whole person who's, you know, in our sphere of awareness. Our unconscious biases, our microaggressions where we want to assert control, you know, just to be able to see this, to see, you know, yeah, I have this view, or here, like I'm scared, or here, this, to start to see this, and then to really keep looking. The recently a black queer man in America, some of you might know, Jericho Brown. He won the Pulitzer Prize for a beautiful poetry book. And he was a black gay man and loves growing flowers, loves gardens, and his father grew lots of gardens, loves blooming colour around him. You know. And he spoke about, you know, in his garden one day, there's really pretty amazing garden, and a white woman coming to the front door, you know, knocking on the front door. I think she wanted to ask a question about the garden. He was working in the garden. She said, and he said, hey, you know, well, welcome, you know. And she said, oh, well, I want to speak to the owner. He's like, hey, you know, I am the owner. She's like, oh, and then he could see her embarrassment, you know, some assumption that he wouldn't be the one to be growing beautiful flowers. And he just stood tall. This is my garden. And he did not take like the denigrating perception that she was putting on him, just stood there steady. And she had to get red and embarrassed. It got back on her. And she sort of scurried away. it's sort of interesting, like this, you know, life will also, I think, sometimes have a way when we're practicing. I think it's sort of fierce grace. Life will sort of try and will kind of like, it sort of smashes us around sometimes, you know, in the places where we're most weak or where we're undeveloped, let's say, weak instead of more of a judgment, where we're undeveloped, where we haven't learned to stand up. Until we stand up, you know, we all know, you know, being in shitty relationships or where there's some dynamics that aren't great, you know, where we've acquiesced or given over or powered over. And at that point, we have to stand up and say, no, you know, the metta, to grow the self-worth, the dignity to be able to claim ourselves, no, that's not okay, you know. Hey, woman, this is my garden. You know? Or no, don't treat me like that. Or the woman in Congressman, I don't, you know, she sort of was calling out because this man had abused her, and then he'd said, hey, I've got daughters too, you know, as if that meant he wouldn't behave badly. It's like, just because you have daughters doesn't mean you're a decent man and you treat women well. That needs to be in all your actions towards women. I am somebody's daughter, you know. She said, you know, she said, I'm glad that I can't remember, maybe it's her mother, I'm glad my dad's not alive to see the way you're treating me. So this kind of, yeah, this standing up, it takes time, warmth, you know, it's not going to come through, hey, you're really weak there, this is where you need to grow, you're such, you know, you're so, I don't know, small there or something like that. It's like hitting a child, you know. It's like, okay, come on, how are we going to get you to stand up? Come on, with the warmth, the nourishment to stand up, to find the voice, the love. You know, I remember seeing how we're going for time. Yeah, we're good. I remember one time working in a fruit shop, and one of the bosses would get very grumpy at times, you know. We start just through the mood, powering over, you know, there'd be a certain gaze, a kind of like intense gaze on you as you were doing your job. I don't know if you've ever felt that, when you feel an aggressive gaze on you, what it can do, you know, to the system. And usually we'd all be allowed to just sort of munch on the fruit as we worked. Because I did this, you know, when I was at art school. But when the boss was around, no one was going to eat any fruit, you know. It's like when the boss is around, there's no fruit to eat. When Mara's around, you don't feel so comfortable eating fruit. Until someone said one day, you know, hey, when you're in this mood, we all feel kind of scared. It's like, oh, really? Oh, I didn't know, you know. Anyway, and he sort of slinked away. And it said when Mara gets seen, you know, when the bully gets seen, it's sort of, when we're not taking the projection from the bully and we're standing strong, it goes back to that person, and it's Mara in the text becomes this almost like child that sort of droops away with no one to play with, you know. There's no one who's going to like pick up his sort of, you know, what he's trying to throw at you. So there's something very vulnerable around someone who has to power over. If you have to power over, what does that say about your spirituality? What needs to be looked at there? Like, I'm curious, you know? And so inside, we can identify with Mara, with our own self-harassment. And sometimes we can over-identify with the projections of others that may be wanting to make us feel smaller, you know? When we can stop identifying with that, you know, the Buddha says that Mara cannot overcome me anymore because I am just empty. I am like the Himalayas. It just moves through, you know? It just comes and it goes. You know, but it will stick to places where we're still growing. And we know that when we are held in more of an aggressive gaze, how that feels, you know. I don't know if you've ever felt that in a certain gaze, you flower. You think about what we need to give ourselves in our practice. A certain gaze, we flower within. It's so beautiful when you're held in that kind of open gaze, you know, and you can move. But when we're held in like that a more limited gaze, I don't know, we can start, you know, getting clumsy. You start not being able to think clearly. What they call it, gaslighting, sometimes, this term, you know. Yeah, you take it on and it affects. So how can we, the practice of metta, give ourselves that warm gaze to saying the same thing, I know, to foster the standing up, really. there's, and some of you would speak about this so much more clear than me, but we all know the way, people can start to internalize the oppressor's view, to internalize racism, and then that's where, it takes a lot to really undo that. So there's just, I feel there's going to be a continual conversation for all of us, and not to go more into this now, but another time. And here in Australia, and reconciliation and the gaze that for so many years was put on Indigenous people, and really feeling that something's moving here around empowerment and reconciliation, and what can start to happen for us as a country to move ahead, what needs to be heard clearly and seen clearly. And that's another bigger conversation to have at some point. To rectify the incorrect perceptions that have caused so much pain, to bring the clearer view. Clear view. So this nourishment to see, this capacity to not respond with the judgment, but with the openness. And I mentioned, and this is coming towards the end of the talk, but I was mentioning how the Buddha reached a point. We could almost put a modern term on this moment. We could say he kind of like, he had been under the thumb of some of his own toxic masculinity. And just to say that too, for men, and I speak here for men and women, the nourishment to stand up, like self-loving men and women, I think is so powerful what can happen. But so the Buddha, he'd been practicing for many, many years. Like I reckon he was the best of anyone, in the sense he was so rigorous. He went to many teachers. He practiced in many different techniques, and he often was the best, like went the furthest than anyone at all of them. He learned from different teachers, but he knew he had to keep going. And at some point he realized, I'm always wanting like another experience. I've got this, I've felt this, but there's always wanting something more. There's another way to do this. There's something else. He said he got so sick, he had actually starved himself, thinking that he had to deny the body and nourishment to wake up. It was so sort of extreme in his rigors. And he could touch, he said he could touch his spine with his finger. This man had really worn himself out, years of very, very deep practice. Then he was just lying down on the ground. And, the first thing, it almost felt like a return to nourishment. He had to, a young girl offered him some rice milk, and many of you heard me say these stories because I love these ones. Offered him rice milk, and he accepted it. I've got to look after my body. I've got to look after this relative life, the earth. And then he went on, and this was a real moment. This is where I meant almost like a sort of breakdown. Like, we're just feeling like nothing's working, He came into that receptivity I spoke about, this real openness. And the memory was of himself. It was like a return to what it is to be at ease as a child. He remembered being under, in the fields, watching the labourers and just being in an easy moment, and just slipped into this depth. And then from there, like I said, like sitting by a river or some sort of ease, his intensity didn't change, but it was held by something else. It was held in a return to some kind of ease and softness and non-pressure. And then that kicked off his next movement under the Bodhi tree, where he really sort of had this deeper transcendent moment. So he accepted the milk, and he remembered being a kid at ease. And then the final moment, as many of you know, when he's under the tree and just about woken up, you know, I mean, and he's seen everything. He's seen all the pain, all the suffering. He's pierced that right view, this openness, something transcendent, something deeper in us than all of that. He's opened his grip, no gripping wide, you know. And then Mara comes again. And Mara comes so many times. We could just do a talk about all the attacks. They're so interesting. This time Mara comes. And really undermining. He's just about to wake up. You know, who do you think you are sitting under this tree thinking that you could wake up, that you might be able to help humanity through what you're doing now? Who do you think you are? And so Mara sends, like, you know, armies of gorgeous, seductive women, you know, uses all the different tricks. And what the Buddha does then, he actually establishes his connection to the ground, his connection to Mother Earth. He says, you know, by the earth's witness, I can wake up. And it's like she, so then rises next to him, this feminine being of nourishment, you know, and he's on his way. So that sense that, you know, we don't just do it on our own. Practice doesn't just happen on our own. It happens in relationship to nature, to the elements, to each other. It's not just this egotistical striving to get better, you know, resting into this deeper network to let something natural start to have space in us, something uncontrived. And then from there, from when we're under the noise, then maybe what is each of our actions? How do we each contribute? And what nourishment do we each need to stand up? And when is it a time for non-action? And then when is it a time for our own action? And all the different ways of that, you know, we have here, you know, amazing writers and social workers and psychologists and psychotherapists and gardeners and school teachers and just deeply kind people. Body workers, I'm just thinking, I mean, there's just so much, you know. But that, yeah, what's that nourishment to sort of keep going? Curious for each of us, you know, and to find a way that's deeper than our appearances or just looking a certain way or doing the right thing, but what's mobilized from something below that is informed by not being just an individual, by some connection. And I think it's so fascinating that the Buddha did say, I mean, and he was very ruthless in how he would speak. I mean, he stayed close to the bone, you know, he wasn't a flowery man in his expression, you know, his listing is very, very clear. He's saying that no other method equals 1/16 of what starts to happen when love enters our practice, when warm, as a mobilizing force. And I just sometimes imagine a little bit like Jesus's gaze or the Buddha's gaze, or I've seen it in some of my own teachers and I know the healing power of it, you know. It's very disarming when we are sort of held in that care, you know, like the knots just naturally sort of start unraveling. It's like, oh, you know, all the different self-views that we have, again, that are incorrect, that are built from the life of the past, that have sort of kinked us out of shape. I'm not this, I'm not that, I can't speak up, I'm not all of it. All these parts that are needing that care to come forward. So in this time, I'm just curious about, you know, all of us as this return, you know, the world being hot, that sort of striving has led us in some pretty dubious directions, some also wonderful ones. But we are also definitely reckoning with the consequences of that disconnected striving that hasn't had the relational component to the earth, to people, to diversity. So we're reckoning with that view. And so sort of in each of our own lives, I suppose I'm curious in this time about just also the simplicity of rhythms that support us to stay connected. the allowance needed, the comment around not having to do this lockdown and get, again, striving in the lockdown to get sort of, what did you should just wrote to me. Do you mind me saying your name? I just so we don't need to get a first distinction. We can just keep meeting ourselves and keep letting go, knowing it will pass, and we can pass. We can pass through. So this whole talk's been to the power of metta, to see clearly, to the view of the clear gaze, deeper than assumptions and prejudices, and a limited view, to really see into an inner eye, the inner eye that can open, that's also a classical term, that can cut through, the clear seeing that says, whoa, this is dignity, this is actually like wounded bully, this is real leadership, this is kind of funky control. And it has some warmth to be able to look at all of this. And so the possibility of having love that is guiding power. So love and power together, love and force. And so in this time that we're all in, if not business not going on as usual, now patterns are interrupted. We're down here in Melbourne for sure for a while. How do we want to keep living? How do we each want to live, and what do we need to do in our daily rhythms to sort of support that, our orientation to life, to what matters to us? I think there's a lot of beauty in that's happening in just the returning to gardens and neighborhoods and simplicity. There's a lot of nourishment in that. Real simple. I'm just like enjoying making my bed well every morning. I mentioned that on the yatra. Ronnie teasing me. I'm like, I'm just through the fire. So I was like, okay, there's a lot. I was digesting a lot and thinking, okay, I'm just gonna make my bed good every morning. Going to cook for this family I'm living with. There's small ways that we go about our days. Okay, I think that's good. So I just finished with one line. It's a little sort of neat and cute, but I think it's kind of lovely. And it says that healing can happen when we treat ourselves and others better than the past did. This opportunity for newer meetings. And the patience needed with our mad minds and our judging minds and our controlling minds, because they have been grooved for a long time. So it's not like, you just go, cool. Like, I'm going to be all self-loving now, like it's a process, it's a practice. And the more Mara comes, the more kind of like we grow. It's not like we're doing anything wrong. It's like that's actually the food that will help us, grow, learn to love, learn to cut through, learn to see. See, it's a painful, beautiful, rocky path, yeah. Imperfection, beautiful imperfection, beautiful not getting straight A's, Being free to just be on the ground, mess up. Okay, I think now I'm getting on a bit of a roll, aren't I, here? So I think that's it. So thank you for your good ears for listening today. In these, to be able to meet together in these times, that have their demands on us. Appreciate your ears and the sincerity of practice today. So much commitment in everybody here. Yes, it's just a thank you. So may we know the view behind the reactivity, and may love and power grow for the benefit of one and all as more and more people come into view. and demand the rightful place around the fire.